Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Okay, welcome, everybody. I am so thrilled to be here with all of you and to be here with our fantastic panel featuring Beto Verissimo, Camilla Cowell, Catherine Hostetler, and Theorio Francos, moderated by Michael Weisberg. So I'm just going to say a word about this event, about the series that it's a part of, the plan for our panel, and then I'll introduce our moderator, Michael, who will introduce the rest of the panel. And again, just extremely thrilled to be here with these brilliant panelists and with all of you in the audience trickling in. So first, very simply, we're here for a couple of reasons. There cannot be a Green New Deal, and there certainly cannot be climate justice more broadly in just one country. This needs to be a global discussion and a global project. And I can also say with confidence, as the son of a Guatemalan immigrant whose family was pretty badly impacted by the 1954 CIA-sponsored coup in Guatemala, that it's not always good when the United States shows leadership in the world. We have to be very careful about that. And I think this week, especially as we watch violent massacres in Colombia and in Palestine by forces in many cases supported by US foreign policy, we truly need a critical and internationalist take. So we've put together this Global Green New Deal panel series, and throughout the series, we're trying to answer a pretty simple question. How should United States-based Green New Dealers and how should other advocates of ambitious climate justice action understand, respond to, and engage with climate politics in other parts of the world? So today's panel is called A Pan-American Green New Deal, Green Investment, Extraction Battles, and Reforestation. We're going to take a largely political economy perspective as well as a political ecology perspective on this question. I want to acknowledge the funders of this event. First and foremost, Perry Worldhouse, which has made this entire panel series possible with a generous grant, as well as the Sociospatial Climate Collaborative, SC2, the McHarg Center, and Penn's Population Studies Center. And so thank you to our sponsors and especially to Perry Worldhouse. And I also want to acknowledge that this panel series is being organized by myself, but also by Billy Flaming, by Theorio Francos, one of our panelists today, and by Kate Aronoff. Next Wednesday, we're going to dive into US engagement with Chinese climate politics, and I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of the event. Now, a little more on the plan for today. In a second, I'll introduce Michael Weisberg, our moderator, and then he will introduce our four panelists. Each panelist will talk for about 12 minutes. Michael will then respond and put a couple of questions to them. They will respond, and then they'll take questions from the audience, which Michael will moderate. So as this event goes on, please feel free to share whatever you want in the chat, and make sure to address that to panelists and audience. But any questions you want to direct to the speakers, put those in the Q&A bubble at the bottom of the screen. None of this will probably be extremely new to you. I'm sure this is nobody's first Zoom call. We will record the event and send the video to everybody who has registered. We're also going to make an online dossier available later this month, in early June, which will have edited transcribed interviews with every panelist and every moderator, along with links to their work so that you can really dive into their ideas and their perspectives. We'll have the recorded videos, of course, of all these events, and we'll have Dissent Magazine as a media partner, which will be turning each of these events into a podcast episode. and we'll have an introductory essay kind of laying out the whole thing. Super exciting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Michael Weisberg, who will then introduce the rest of the panel. Michael Weisberg is Senior Faculty Fellow and Director of Postgraduate Programs at Perry Worldhouse. He's a professor and chair of philosophy at the University of Pennsylvania. He serves as editor-in-chief of Biology and Philosophy, advisor to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Nairobi Work Program. He directs Penn's campus-wide transdisciplinary research in the Galapagos, and he's a contributing author to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's Sixth Assessment Report. And on a sort of personal note, Michael has been a huge supporter of global climate research here at Penn, especially through Perry Worldhouse. Michael's been a huge leader on campus for global climate research. So thank you, Michael, very much for that leadership. And I'll now turn it over to you to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks so much, Daniel, and welcome everybody, and welcome to our really wonderful and distinguished panel. I'm going to introduce everybody all at once, and then we'll just, they'll present sequentially. Just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to put questions as you have them in the Q&A, and what I'll be doing is harvesting the questions and trying to get as many of them as possible posed to the panel. So please feel free at any time, though, to put a question in the Q&A box. So we have a really, really special, wonderful panel today to take us through this really interesting and complex and many-faceted issue. So the first speaker is Beto Verissimo, who is the co-founder of Amazon, a think and do tank organization based in the Brazilian Amazon, founded in 1990. He holds a master's degree in ecology from Penn State University and a graduate degree in agricultural engineering from the Federal Rural University of the Brazilian Amazon. His work has helped create about 25 million hectares of conservation units in the Amazon, and support forest management for 7 million further hectares. In the last year, he's worked on several different strategies to reduce the level of deforestation and forest degradation in the Amazon. He's the recipient of several awards, including the Skoll Foundation Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Our second speaker is Camilla Cowell, who holds a PhD in economics of climate change from the University of East Anglia. She's got a master's degree in economics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and a degree in economics from the University of Sao Paulo. She's been working in the area of sustainability for more than 10 years, and she's currently an economics affairs officer at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean at its office in Brazil. Our third speaker is Catherine Hostetler, who's professor and head of Department of International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She's been researching and publishing on environmental politics in South America for more than 3 decades. Her work includes studies of social movements, environmental policy, trade agreements, development finance, and participation in international environmental negotiations. Her most recent book is Political Economies of Energy Transition, Wind and Solar Power in Brazil and South Africa, which pays particular attention to the relationship between economic and environmental aims in the electricity sectors of these emerging powers. And finally, last but not least, Thea Rio-Francos is an associate professor of political science at Providence College, an Andrew Carnegie Fellow, and a Radcliffe Institute Fellow. Her research focuses on resource extraction, renewable energy, climate change, green technology, social movements, and the left in Latin America. These themes are explored in her book, Resource Radicals, From Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. And she, of course, has co-authored a book with our organizer today, Daniel Aldana Cohen, A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. She has further many academic publications, but also her writings appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, the Boston Review, N+1, Dissent, Jacobin, among others. She is a member of the DSA and serves on the organization's Green New Deal's campaign committee. To our panel, great welcome to Penn. I wish you could all be here in person, but we will take what we can get and have you today on Zoom. And I turn the floor to you, Beto, our first speaker.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here. I just want to share some perspective on what's going on in the Amazonia region. So just to everybody be on the same page, we're talking about a continental size territory. It's the size of US continent without Alaska, talking about only not Brazilian side, but the entire Amazon basin that includes other 8 countries. Brazil holds 2/3 of the territory. So recently, we get a combination of what I can call perfect storm. So we get a social pressure. Amazonia is facing poverty, inequality, Brazilian Amazon, 80% of the population is black and brown, and they have income average very below the Brazilian average. So they're facing several struggles. And economics is very high carbon emission economy. A Brazilian Amazon GDP represents about only 7%, 8% of the Brazilian GDP, but it's contribute with 42% of the country's global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's very inefficient system. It's based on clear cut the forest and deforestation, forest degradations, and forest fires. So, and that's the third element, is the environmental impact. Right now, we have this combination of forest fires moving up, illegal logging has been increasing the last 2 years, deforestation is moving up again, and the forest degradation, it means all the elements that are facing, that are attracting and threat the forest. So that's the situation right now. Although the Brazil government has changed a little bit the rhetoric in some recent meeting, for example, the climate meeting, the reality in the field is different. Deforestation, for example, last month, April, jumped 42% compared to the previous year, the same April 2020. The less enforcement in the field, more social conflict, more emissions, more trouble. So that was what's going on right now in the Brazilian side. But if you go to the other countries, situation is not good as well. So everybody knows that to achieve the Paris Agreement, we need to keep forests, especially the tropical forests, conserved. And right now, it's sad to say, but those forests are very threatened. We already lose 20% of forest cover in just the case of the Brazilian Amazon side. And some scientists has raised alarm that the tipping point where deforestation of the forest becoming more savanna type of vegetation with a huge consequence of climate and biodiversity loss, it's probably very close. So it's probably 25%. If we keep the same pace of deforestation, we can reach those tipping point very soon. So I think the Green New debate that has been so important in the US is not yet starting in Brazil. So the Brazil now, right now, there is no actually a conversation around the idea of country to decarbonize its economy. And actually, Brazil was one of the few countries that increased emissions last year, thanks to the deforestation that was moving very high. And deforestation has no relation with economic growth. It's really, deforestation in the Amazon is just like organized crime in most of cases, and doesn't really, if the economy moving down, deforestation moving up, emissions moving up. Way out of this. I think there are three major elements that we need to consider. One, the payment for environmental services, it's always important. I think, and some forest carbon market mechanism should be considered if the institutional situation improves. Another field is, of course, improve better management of land use has been already and let's not but not less whole role of reforestation. So just to give idea, we already lose an area as size at Texas and the Amazon region, but an area bigger than Pennsylvania and take the neighbor state of New Jersey and Maryland already has been degraded and left behind. So there was a tremendous opportunity to reclaim those lands and plant forests and use several mechanisms to do so. And the forest, it might provide a very important nature-based solution to carbon sequestration. So right now, just to complete my first presentation here, we are facing a tremendous political crisis, as U.S. has faced last year. COVID, the pandemic, the social consequence of the pandemic, and on the top of that, the situation in the Amazon is out of control in terms of deforestation and social conflict, especially among the indigenous communities that they are suffering a lot in terms of has land grabbers and gold miners and illegal loggers approaching to the territory. Yesterday, we have the just conflict between the Yanomami in the north part of Brazilian Amazon border with Venezuela and try to protect the land against gold miners. It just was a tragic incident that's still going on. We don't know how it's going to solve it with death. And so situation, and in terms of the Brazilian Amazon, it's just to end and put a note that we are in a perfect storm of problems, although the solution is possible, but we have to change the political course to do so.
Thank you so much, Beto. The next speaker is Camilla. Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to thank especially the organizers, the moderator, and everyone who is responsible for this interesting event. I will share a presentation with you now. So I wanted to use the 10 minutes that I have to tell you a bit about an approach that we have been developing from ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, that is called the Big Push for Sustainability. Briefly, so the presentation is going to be based a lot on our recent sessions documents, and particularly on the chapter 3, in which we present simulations of scenarios for different trajectories of recovery in the region. And I think that these scenarios can help us understand the importance of multilateralism and of thinking globally of these issues. So the Big Push for Sustainability is an approach that ECLAC or CEPAL has been developing to shape a transformative recovery. We understand that the recovery should be transformative in the sense that the old path prior to the pandemic is no longer available, or it's no longer sustainable either economically, socially, or environmentally. So the point of departure is that the current development routes are unsustainable, and they weren't sustainable even before the pandemic, which has made structural development problems more visible. Also, we depart from an understanding that inaction tends to aggravate development gaps. And just to give an example, the climate emergency is the type of problem that aggravates, for instance, poverty, inequality. It creates further problems from trade specialization in natural resource goods, etc. And the proposal is very much focused on investments, on the idea that investments can be, in the short term, a driver of economic growth, of job recovery, of income creation. And in the long term, it is actually the link between the short and the long term, in the sense that the investments that are made today explain tomorrow's productive structure. So in the document, we assess different paths and different types of recovery policies that are based in the Big Push for Sustainability. We have simulated these scenarios with a model named A3ME. I'm not going into details. You can see that in the document. But just a brief overview about the scenarios. We have modeled or tried to capture the impacts of 4 different trajectories. One would be the old normal, a scenario in which the pandemic did not exist. This is a useful model in the sense that many of the climate commitments of Latin American countries, they draw upon a business as usual scenario that did not foresee the pandemic. We also have a COVID-19 pandemic scenario that tries to capture the impacts of the pandemic on the economy, on emissions. And then we have two types of big push for sustainability scenario. We have an unconditional scenario that tries to replicate or reproduce the unconditional climate commitments of Latin American countries as stated in their nationally determined contributions. And we also have a more ambitious or a more aggressive scenario that is the conditional scenario, in which Latin American countries have more ambitious climate targets, and there's also more international cooperation. The types of policies, the types of instruments that we have simulated, and these are merely indicative of the types of policy instruments that could be used to drive, to push for a new cycle of low carbon sustainable investments, are fiscal incentives for renewable energy, mandatory fuel blends, regulation to increase electric vehicles, investments in reforestation to recover natural capital. And these would be financed in our scenarios by phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, and also part of the resources that are released from gradually removing fossil fuel subsidies are used to strengthen the health infrastructure in the region. So moving forward to the results, what we have found is that the COVID-19 had severe impacts on the economy. We have simulated a decrease or a reduction in the region's GDP in Latin America and the Caribbean GDP of 9.1%, which was the estimate that we had when the report was released. We now know that this reduction has been around 7.7%, but this scenario represents, we can understand it as what would happen in the absence of counter-cyclical policies. So this reduction is actually severe. The 7.7 reduction that was actually observed from the COVID-19 pandemic impact is the largest economic impact, or the largest economic crisis the region has observed in at least 120 years. So we are facing really a dramatic moment in the region. When we look at the impacts in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, what you can see in this graph is the emissions level compared to the 2019, that is prior to the pandemic. And what we see is that in 2020, there was a slight reduction in emissions. Of course, this is very much linked to the social isolation measures and also to the economic contraction. But what we observe is that these emissions tend to grow in the absence of green or sustainable policies. And actually, in the region, which is the red line, these emissions tend to grow even faster following 2026 than in the rest of the world. And this is linked basically with the prices of fossil fuels in the region. So what this graph tells us is that in the absence of recovery policies and in the absence of policies that seek to achieve climate goals, there will be an increase in greenhouse gas emissions that is not compatible with the Paris Agreement goals. So what have we observed in the contrasting scenarios, in the scenarios that have big push for sustainability policies? In the unconditional scenario, which is the lighter one, let's say, that is based on unilateral measures that do not depend, that are unconditional regarding what other countries do and regarding international support, there would be a 13% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in 2030 compared to the business as usual scenario. And in the conditional, we would achieve 10 percentage points more reduction. So the conditional scenario would deliver more greenhouse gas emission reductions. And regarding the GDP, what we see in this graph here, in the continuous lines, you can see in the blue one, the conditional scenario, the one that has more international cooperation, and it can be understood as a scenario of a global Green New Deal because all countries are taking part in climate action. And the yellow or the green one is the unconditional one, the one in which only Latin American countries take unilateral action to reduce emissions as a way to recover from the crisis. And in the dotted lines, you can see the same scenario, but results are shown for other countries in the world. So what we see in this graph is that actually the Green New Deal or the conditional scenario presents a slightly higher GDP performance compared to unilateral action. In terms of employment, the results are quite similar. The impact is very close for both scenarios. Both deliver employment, net employment generation. And in this table here, which is summarizes the main results, we can see that there's GDP growth in both big push for sustainability scenarios. Both scenarios also deliver employment creation. And what's interesting is that only in the global Green New Deal, in the conditional scenario, there is a decrease in inequality, which brings back the point of climate justice that was just mentioned. Both scenarios have very positive impact on the trade balance, and of course, they would meet the NDC unconditional and conditional targets. So to conclude, the main impacts that we observed from this exercise is that the policies that are based on a big push for sustainability, that are focused on increasing sustainable investments, they can have a positive impact on jobs and the GDP, but the impact is better, the impact is more positive in a scenario in which there is a global environment agreement. These results also indicate that unilaterally applied policies in Latin American countries, they could increase inequality related to the business as usual scenario, but in a scenario with international cooperation, this effect disappears. So I think these are the main messages I wanted to share with you. I'm sorry this was so fast, but I hope I could give you some insights into what we are doing. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And our next speaker is Catherine. Catherine, you have the floor.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here, and let me see where somehow I've lost my slide sharing option. Oh, there we go. So I'm actually in exactly the right point in this talk, because I follow up really nicely on Camilla's presentation. Camilla tells us there's potential in some scenarios for having a Green New Deal in Latin America. And the way that I've prepared my presentation is to say, well, if there's generally this potential, what are some of the things that might affect in particular cases, whether or not that potential for a Green New Deal scenario is achieved? And this is based on this book I've just recently published on political economies of energy transition. And there's a chart near the beginning of the book that looks like this. And it's a kind of interesting chart, because if you read the IPCC reports and you read the things that people say about climate change, everyone says, we need a lot of wind and solar power. We need a lot of these new renewables. And so it can be a little strange to look at a chart like this then and see how dramatically different the outcomes are for wind and solar power in Brazil and South Africa. So the top line here is Brazilian wind power. And as you can see, it's really grown quite substantially and is currently about 10% of the built capacity in electricity in Brazil. But the slowest one of these kinds of electricity to develop is Brazilian solar power, that dark red line that starts latest and is still very low. And so And then South Africa, both wind and solar power are sort of in between the Brazilian wind and solar stories. And so I think there's really an interesting puzzle here that tells us sometimes maybe we can achieve the Green New Deal, and sometimes maybe there are some barriers to it that are worth thinking about. And I know that South Africa is not Latin American, but I think the contrast still tells us some important things about what might be possible in Latin America. And the basic framework for how I think about these issues is, I think, very connected to the ideas of the Green New Deal. And there are a couple of things that I think the Green New Deal idea brings to us. One of them is the observation that climate issues shouldn't be narrowly defined, but climate issues are housing issues, and housing issues are climate issues, and that there's actually a climate dimension to a whole series of different issues that are part of the political economy. And then many aspects of the political economy have a lot to do with climate, even if we haven't always thought about them as climate politics. And for me, at least, part of the idea of talking about a Green New Deal and the way that it resonates in the US context in particular is with the idea that sometimes states can be partners in this enterprise, that states can really lead out, private actors too, and that what you're really looking for are these coalitions that get built across a wide array of sectors and between both state and societal actors. And so part of the orientation of my book then is to say that energy transition is at least 4 different major sectors, and that each of them pose really interesting puzzles or potential problems for transition, but also potential opportunities. And so in climate change, we have this basic question of whether states can identify long-term national interests, like working on climate change, and work towards them even over the interests of powerful actors. And you can view wind and solar power through that kind of climate perspective. But you can also look at wind and solar power from these other very different perspectives. Industrial power, industrial policy. Can states support new industries? Can they generate jobs? It's about consumption issues too. What does this mean for consumers? And the fourth of the political economies that I look at is what happens to local communities that host these infrastructure projects. And my argument is that each of these is going on at the same time. And oftentimes you'll have somewhat different actors playing the different roles. Environmental ministries when it's climate change, but ministries of industry when it's industrial policy, and utilities when it's distribution and consumption issues. So there's a really wide array of actors that are engaging with the challenges of energy transition and the challenges of a Green New Deal all at once. And so there's this kind of final question about how these different stories either reinforce each other or work against each other that I think are some very important kinds of questions to ask about the Green New Deal. And so I have 3 short examples here. We have what I call the success story of Brazilian wind power. And this chart here on the left is the planning for wind power that out of the Brazilian Empresa de Pesquisa Energética, the energy research agency. And as you can see here, it's a pretty steady upward move. Every year starts with the current reality and then projects out the next year. And you see year after year, they keep deciding to do more wind power. And I think the story for that is very much a story about the possibility of industrial policy for promoting energy transition. There are a couple of things that go on here. One of them is that if you want to win an auction to build electricity for the Brazilian electricity sector, you need to be cheap. And one of the ways to be cheap is to have finance from the Brazilian National Development Bank, BNDES. But BNDES, because it's devoted to creating jobs, requires that a lot of the components and machinery for wind power be made in Brazil, 60% local content. And that actually is comparatively easy to do in Brazil. And there's this incentive to do it because of the finance. And so what I say happens here is you get this positive green spiral that goes on, where there's first a bit of demand for wind power through a program called ProInfa, and then you develop the beginning of a wind energy industry, which then comes back and lobbies for more wind energy, and then there's more public demand for wind. And it's this kind of positive reinforcing cycle where you get the private interests of the wind power industry reinforcing this public interest in having this new form of renewable energy in this self-reinforcing green spiral. And as I note here, another aspect of sort of government support for this is that the early wind expansion comes during a series of Workers' Party governments, PT governments, that have more expansive industrial policies. And so you have really quite substantial positive outcomes in the wind sector, about 100,000 wind jobs, and about a quarter of those in manufacturing. So there really is a set of advantages that come with wind power. But you know, my final point here, it's not all rosy, because about 25% of the host communities for these wind farms mobilized against hosting them. And these were, for the most part, poor communities in the Brazilian Northeast who started to no longer have access to beaches or to land that they had historically used. And I'd be very happy to talk some more about that, that sort of darker side of what I'm otherwise calling a success story. So why was solar delayed? Well, a big part of that was actually about the cost structure. Solar power was simply so expensive that Brazilian planners were not willing to use it for a long time. And then in this case, actually, the Brazilian desire to build an industry around solar power in many ways slowed it down, because it's very hard to get 60% local content in solar power unless you import a lot of expensive machinery, and then you're still basically importing this machinery. And the finance that came from BNDES was not much cheaper than the alternatives. And that dynamic meant that that kind of self-reinforcing green spiral never really happened with Brazilian solar. And then because solar power only really began to be considered after 2014, most of solar power developed under the Temer and Bolsonaro governments, which have very little industrial policy. And so you get then much weaker results in the solar industry in Brazil, only 10,000 solar jobs at the last count, and most of those in installation. So very temporary jobs of just putting up solar panels. And in this case, there wasn't really a lot of contribution from the ability to use solar power for underserved communities. Only about 3,500 units actually were built in the Luz para Todos program, the Light for All program that started in the Lula administration. So it's a story then of, it's not failure exactly, but it is very much a delay. And in some ways, some of the Green New Deal components, some of the extra components that should have supported solar power ended up either not helping it or working against it. And then just a stalemate story, South Africa. And I love this picture that I have here of the planning process in South Africa, because I think it shows very graphically that South Africans simply couldn't decide how much they were going to build of wind and solar power. And a big part of what happened in South Africa is that there's a parastatal utility, Eskom. It's historically produced all of South Africa's electricity, and it is based on coal. And it fought to the death for a long time because it saw an energy transition as really an existential issue for it. And I'm almost running out of time, so I won't debate it. But what you have and what you find in South Africa then is this really pitched battle between the two sides, the pro-transition and the anti-transition, and they really fight each other to a stalemate. And along with that then comes a very contentious just transition debate on every front. Coal communities are worried about the transition. Coal-linked labor is worried about the transition. Underserved households are worried about the transition. And all of these actors are the Black South African actors who historically were dispossessed in apartheid and who still have not managed to find a place in the new South Africa. And the energy transition, many of them feel, is one that's not adequately taking account of their historic losses. And so then just to complete with some lessons for partners in the US and otherwise, I mean, I think that the examples show that there are some really potentially important roles for both state and society actors in a Green New Deal and an energy transition, but I wouldn't expect to find formulas, because even in Brazil, the same country, the things that work in wind don't work in solar power. And for that reason, I think it's really important to be paying attention to local partners who will know the history, who know what apartheid means, who know what the slave communities, the Quilombola communities in northeastern Brazil have lived through historically. It's really important to have those local partners. But there's also a very strong appeal of having co-benefits of climate action, having some kinds of results in jobs or in the provision of electricity for people who haven't had it. And so I think it shows the importance of these co-benefits. And here I think I can make a nice transition to Thea. What I think Thea is going to talk about is that to remember, this is really the last point here, that even positive transitions can carry costs. And that includes, and maybe is especially for historically disadvantaged populations, and those costs also need to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and we really appreciate this. And our final speaker before we turn to discussion is Thea.
Thank you so much. Yes, that was a great segue into my presentation. Give me a moment here. So I'm going to be discussing the extractive frontiers of the Green New Deal, which is exactly those types of costs that were just mentioned. But I think there'll actually be quite a number of resonances across the presentations. I want to start with a different beginning than some of our other presentations or all of our other presentations did, because I'm not going to start in Latin America. I'm going to start in the United States briefly and then take us sort of back to Latin America. The Green New Deal, this whole panel is answering the question of what are the implications, the possibilities, and the challenges of a US-based Green New Deal for Latin America, and also what would a global Green New Deal look like. So what is the Green New Deal? We actually got some great definitions just now from Kathy, but I'm going to kind of give my own slant on it, which is that the Green New Deal is a climate policy paradigm that hits at the intersection of climate change and inequality. And it does so by first and foremost addressing the climate crisis at the scale and speed and rapidity that the climate science demands and that global climate justice also demands. It does so by leveraging public investment, the public sector, and areas of policy that are often underutilized with regards to climate policy, like industrial policy, as Kathy pointed out. I think in its sort of most ambitious framing, it transforms every sector of social and economic life with these principles in mind. We're going to address the climate crisis. We're going to do so in a way that transforms inequality into egalitarianism, and we're going to do so quickly with a big push, to use Camilla's term, from the public sector. So the most ambitious and bold proposals that we've gotten under this rubric look like public ownership of the energy system, community ownership as also, and worker ownership of the energy system. It looks like a just transition for the communities on the front lines of the climate crisis, with targeted investment in those places, and also for workers in the industries that we will need to phase out as we move to a renewable energy system. In that vein, it looks like demanding green, unionized, dignified jobs, and building out rebuilding our built environment in ways that are green and socially just. And Kathy mentioned housing, and I think that sector bears particular emphasis. So these ideas have come through an intersection and a synergy between social movements on the ground and progressive policymakers, and they've come from different regions of the US, but also been expressed nationally, so to speak, in the halls of power of Washington, DC, with various proposals in Congress. So that is the Green New Deal. As you can see, as I've spelled out, it's usually conceived in domestic terms, but I think that everything on this panel makes clear that you can't isolate a country out of the global political economy. I think the most obvious and most talked about implications of a Green New Deal in the US would be rapid progress on slashing US emissions, which is again, a key demand of the global climate justice movement, given the US's historic share of emissions, as well as the fact that we still have the highest per capita emissions in the world. But an area that's less talked about, though, is gaining some salience, is that there would be implications in a directly kind of material sense in terms of the material inputs for an energy transition in the US and globally. And so that looks at the material footprint of the Green New Deal, a footprint that is everywhere, that is planetary in scope. And the reason that we ought to focus on these extractive implications of a Green New Deal, of an energy transition, are that what are variously called green technologies, clean technologies, or new energy technologies, whatever your preferred term is, they are extremely material intensive and specifically mineral intensive. And this gives us a sense of the kind of variegated extractive portfolio of these technologies with a bit of a change over time in terms of what types of extraction are required by the energy system. And this, from the World Bank, and there are lots of other forecasts out there, gives us a sense of the growing demand of commodities like graphite, lithium, cobalt, and others in order to rebuild energy systems around the world, right? So these are the mining requirements of the energy transition. We also know, I think everyone on this panel is aware and has spoken to in various ways, that extractive models of development have lots of environmental and social costs for directly affected communities and ecosystems. And this is no different when the extraction is used for green purposes, right? When the end use is green technologies. Hence the term that has been coined by activists and scholars of the subject, green extractivism. And so green extractivism has impacts on wildlife, freshwater, and marine ecosystems, leaves behind toxic waste, exposes communities to various health risks and territorial dispossession and violence, and also has grave risks for workers that work at mine sites. This is in general across extractive industries, including those relevant to an energy transition. But to get a little bit more concrete, I want to zoom in on a particular commodity that is going to be in high demand as the energy transition progresses, which is lithium. And I want to zoom in on it particularly in Chile, which is the second biggest producer of lithium in the world. And also I will note the top producer of copper, which is another big extractive sector related to the energy transition. And so what is lithium? Lithium is used in lithium batteries, which are necessary to electrify ground transportation. So those are the batteries that go in electric vehicles, electric buses, and it's also necessary for storage on renewable grids. As we saw a few moments ago with that World Bank chart, demand for lithium will increase astronomically, so much so and so quickly that there's a lot of forecasts of a potential supply crunch sometime over the next decade or two. And also related to the prior slide, lithium extraction carries with it a lot of social and environmental impacts. So I'm going to take us to those right now. In Chile, lithium is extracted from the Atacama Desert in the country's north. It is a breathtaking and beautiful landscape that I had the privilege to conduct field work in 2019. So this gives us a sense of the immediate landscape, and lithium is in brine deposits underneath these salt flats in the Atacama Desert. This is what the lithium installations look like. They are enormous, and the process basically involves sucking lithium out from deposits under sucking the brine, I should say, from deposits underneath the salt flats and arraying it on enormous evaporation ponds, and then kind of letting the sun and wind do the work to evaporate and concentrate that liquid, which is further refined elsewhere in Chile and then further industrialized elsewhere in the world into batteries. This process has a lot of environmental and social threats to the neighboring indigenous communities. There are 18 indigenous communities that ring the salt flat, and they've seen specifically effects on their ability to access fresh water. And I'm happy to answer this in Q&A, but the process of extracting the lithium-rich brine lowers the freshwater table and makes it harder for farmers and local indigenous communities and campesinos to access. So that is a sense of the social and environmental impacts of lithium extraction. And these impacts have occasioned a number of quite potent political demands in Chile. There have been demands over the years to nationalize lithium. Right now, those lithium installations are owned and operated by two multinational lithium companies. There have been demands around labor rights. Workers on the lithium installations have faced severe retaliation for attempting to unionize. There have been demands around Indigenous prior consultation and consent for the Indigenous peoples that live around the salt flats. There has been nothing like a rigorous consultation or consent process. And there have been militant forms of environmental and Indigenous critiques of extraction itself, right? So this is anti-extractive protest. And this is a bit of a sense of what that protest looks like. It often takes the form, and Latin Americanists and Latin Americans are familiar with the road blockade as a genre of protest in Latin America that's particularly powerful at the choke points of the global extractive economy. And so we see this protest in Chile, but we also see it in neighboring countries that share this set of geologic features and ecosystems across the Andean plateau. So there's also lithium extraction in Argentina, which is the number 3 producer of lithium in the world. And so why are lithium politics so charged, and why are there these militant demands for no more lithium extraction coming from Indigenous communities and their environmental allies in Chile? So I think this speaks to something that's come up a few times in this talk, but I want to kind of surface in this panel, I should say, but I want to surface more directly, which is the charged politics and complex political economy of resource extraction in Latin America. So you have a long history that we could trace over 500 years, but was recently intensified during the commodity boom at the turn of this millennium of high levels of resource dependency and also of various left-wing proposals for how to address the historic ills of that commodity boom, of that commodity dependency, and specifically during the recent commodity boom, a lot of these became salient. I want to just note that these charged politics are not just historical, whether that longue durée 500-year history or that recent history of them getting particularly salient during the recent commodity boom, but they are the current and near future politics of the region as well. So market analysts are predicting a new commodity boom, and that new commodity boom is linked to the demands for raw materials that are in part a product of the energy transition itself. So a kind of paradoxical set of circumstances where the technologies needed to confront the climate crisis will also likely trigger a commodity boom. That commodity boom has the environmental and social consequences that I've given you a taste of. But there are other factors aside from global demand that are going to bring these raw materials to the forefront again in politics in Latin America in the coming years. One, as we've already heard, is the severe economic collapse triggered by the COVID and the responses to COVID. So we have in Latin America double the global rate of global GDP contraction. We have the most indebted region in the world. So an enormous debt crisis in Latin America. We also have both pre-pandemic and during the pandemic protests against austerity, which is some of the ways that governments have sought to deal with the economic collapse and the debt crisis. All of these combined could potentially incentivize extraction. Extraction is a relatively easy way for governments to accrue revenues, to both address the debt crisis and address very fundamental social demands for more spending to deal with the health crisis and the lack of income. So we see a lot of factors that are pushing to potentially incentivize extraction in the region. We also see this complex political panorama that we could talk about more, which I think makes the prospects for a more socially and environmentally regulated approach to extractive sectors more questionable. And I want to just flag and actually to resonate with what Daniel said at the outset of this panel with the sort of violence that we're seeing around the world on the part of governments, in some cases supported directly by the United States, are the risks that anti-extractive protesters face in Latin America. And it's been called by multiple human rights agencies the most dangerous place to be a water or land defender. And this has specific consequences for the extractive sectors that are linked to the energy transition. So here's a chart from the Business and Human Rights Center that is specifically looking at transition minerals, the minerals needed for green technologies. And we see that South America has by far the most human rights allegations linked to those sectors, which both speaks to the sector's size and their economies, but also to the militancy of protests, because these allegations come from the communities themselves, right? So this is it gives you a sense of, again, how charged the politics are of extractive sectors in Latin America, and how much that will potentially increase as the energy transition unfolds. And I know I just have a little less than a minute here, so I'm going to run through this slide quickly, but I think it'll segue nicely into our conversation. So the animating question of my research and of the advocacy that I do around the Green New Deal is this question of, is there a zero-sum trade-off between confronting the climate crisis by developing and deploying green technologies needed to transition us to a renewable energy system on the one hand, and on the other hand, the need to protect and preserve local environments, respect local livelihoods and rights of Indigenous self-determination? Is there a zero-sum trade-off between these two desiderata? And I'm not even gonna go through all of these bullet points because I wanna save plenty of time for discussion, but I wanna note that there are multiple pathways to decarbonization. And I think actually Camilla showed this very well from a slightly different angle, but to make the same point, which is that it matters how we decarbonize, not just in terms of equity and global cooperation, which is what Camilla emphasized, but also in terms of the way that built environments, energy systems, transit systems, housing, all of those are designed and decarbonized in the global north, right? And there are ways to do so that are much less resource dependent and ways to do so that are very resource dependent. And I think we should see this as a critical juncture between more and less resource dependent ways from the global north, particularly, to embark on an energy transition. And that, just to reiterate, that the energy transition is a thoroughly material transition, and we should be intentional as policymakers, scholars, and activists to see it through a material lens, that the Green New Deal principles ought to apply not just within the US, but across borders, across scales, and across nodes of the global political economy, and that there's a lot of potential, I think, for US-based activism and progressive policy in coordination with Latin American movements, multilateral institutions, and governments to push for a non-extractive Green New Deal that respects these principles across the world. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Thea. So we will, as soon as we're able to, bring all of the panel back on. Maybe Emma can help us allow our cameras back on. There we go. So again, thank you all to the entire panel. It was super interesting. You brought so many distinct issues, but there's so many interesting areas of overlap. And I actually wanted to start by asking you all a really kind of a big picture question. It was inspired a little bit by something Beto said towards the beginning of his remarks, but I think it's threaded throughout. And he said that in Brazil, at least, there's not yet a substantial discussion about the Green New Deal. And I think that's, largely true throughout Latin America. So I have a simple question, which I suspect is very complex to all of you, which is what would it take to start a serious discussion about the Green New Deal in Latin America? Thea, it looks like you're leaning in, so you start.
Sorry, I forgot that I was unmuted when I kind of started to answer that.
I suspect you have a lot to say about this. So
I do. I have some to say, but I'm actually very curious what others have to say as well. But I'll just start us off, which is that I think that there is a conversation about the Green New Deal in Latin America, but it's not called the Green New Deal. If that sort of makes sense. Like there are conversations about the intersection between inequality and the climate crisis, and between inequality, social and economic inequality, and the harms of the extractive sectors. So I think that these conversations are happening in just under different terms, but with some shared kind of principles and parameters. And one of them we've already heard about today, which is the big push, right? Which I think is one source of this regional conversation. We also have the Pacto Ecosocial, or the Ecosocial Pact, which was elaborated by left-wing intellectuals and activists in Argentina, but kind of took off regionally. And what that basically proposes is a reorientation of the regional economy away from extractivism and towards care-based sectors, which has a lot of resonance with some of the ways that the Green New Deal has been discussed here in the US. But I want to note that that's something that the Pacto Ecosocial adds to the conversation that's not in sort of domestic US Green New Deal dialogues, is the importance of canceling sovereign debt, lowering and or canceling sovereign debt. And that speaks to the connection that I drew, and part of the inspiration for the connection that I drew in my presentation, which is that it's very hard to imagine an equitable energy transition, or even any type of energy transition with the public sector involved in Latin America, under the types of fiscal constraints that Latin American governments now find themselves. And one key source of that fiscal constraint are the debt levels. And I think that calls on global institutions and the US to take a role in lowering that debt. So that's something that the Pacto Ecosocial conversation has really added to these discussions. But I'd love to hear from others as well.
I have many follow-ups, but I would also like to hear from others on the big question first. Catherine, were you leaning into your camera to take the floor?
Oh, I can always talk about things like the Green New Deal. And I was wanting to go last so I could then make like the counter argument. And
well, because I was going to ask you about, you suggested it's way more complicated. I mean, that was my follow-up was going to be like, no, so it sounds great until you actually try to do it.
No. I actually have something else to say about it, because I mean, I do think that there's a real value in the Green New Deal idea, because it has this great packaging. You know, you can say it and people think about it and they know what you mean, and it has all of these things that it evokes, you know, in terms of sort of like, let's have society really move towards this goal together. But the point that I was going to make, maybe it's a little bit, I don't know, trollish, but of course we are on the internet. So, I mean, the point I was going to make is that sometimes actually, I think one of the things about the Green New Deal is that it tells you that sometimes it can be an advantage not to have people talking about the Green New Deal, that there are in fact all these other things that are climate action. And sometimes you can actually get more climate action by not labeling it a climate issue. And that, you know, if like a Green New Deal by stealth has certain kinds of advantages as well. And in fact, I think when you look at the electricity sector in particular, probably the biggest driver of any kind of energy transition that's going on right now is simply cost calculations. Like, you know, wind and solar power have become really cheap options compared to what they were before and compared to alternatives. And so sometimes I think, you know, what the Green New Deal language lets us see, those of us who are really interested in the Green New Deal, is that there are other things going on that, you know, without anybody necessarily valuing the Green New Deal, qua Green New Deal, can still be very important parts of our transition and our thinking about how to bring about important change. But like I said, that's a little bit trollish, and it would have been better after everybody talked about, you know, the purposes of a Green New Deal. I mean, I do think that it's important as a kind of galvanizing concept and of making us think about a big push. But sometimes the things that we value can come about without anybody particularly having it as a political platform, but it's just, you know, the cheap kind of electricity. And I'm willing to take those gains as well.
Thanks, Catherine. And actually, I'll just say, like, I you know, for me as someone who, like, I remember my grandparents, you know, talking about how, you know, the New Deal and Roosevelt, how important this was, like, in our family. So obviously, like, it has all this extra resonance. And I wonder, yeah, I was actually thinking, Beto and Camilla, it'd be interesting to hear your perspective, because I assume your grandparents weren't talking about Theodore Roosevelt, or if they were, it was a different conversation. And, you know, does this feel less urgent, therefore, in that packaging?
There's a lot of conversation about the Green New Deal in Brazil. What's lacking at the leadership of the government to push for. So it's without government leadership, there is not to make the transition that we needed. Second, I think the emissions in Brazil is very comes from deforestation and land use change. It's very different for US emissions and other countries. So more than half is actually come from when you combine land use and deforestation. And sometimes, in some years, it can go up to 2/3 of the emissions. And third, I think Brazil, although the situation is quite difficult in Brazil right now, Brazil has unique position among, let's say, the 12 major economy in the world to be a neutral carbon country if move in the right direction, because most of the emissions come from deforestation. Deforestation make no sense in terms of economic development, and the country has already energy in the right direction. Catherine mentioned about the wind power. It still has hydroelectric power as well. So it's not a country that has huge problem with emissions associated with energy. So if Brazil take the Green New Deal in a tropical fashion style, can be different, and can be actually a country that has a lot to gain, both in social and economics.
Thanks. Camilla or Daniel, did you want to contribute to this question?
Yeah. I can't unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I wanted to tell you a bit more about the work that we have been doing at ECLAC with the big push for sustainability. So we have actually established a series of cooperations with various countries in the region in this line of developing strategies for a transformative recovery with sustainability and with equality. For instance, with Costa Rica, we work on the bioeconomy national strategy, on the electric mobility actions they're taking into account. We have also actions with Colombia, with Argentina, with Mexico, and here in Brazil, I'm based in ECLAC's Brazil office. We actually have a cooperation with the Brazilian Senate. Within the Brazilian Senate, there is a formal institutional space that was created to formulate legislative proposals for a big push for sustainability in Brazil. It's actually called the Big Push for Sustainability Subcommission. And for this year and the next one, the senator that is currently president of this subcommission was elected president of the Environment Commission. And we are at the stage now of designing a broader collaboration, more activities, and bring the whole discussion of building sustainable exit strategies for this current crisis within the Environment Commission of the Brazilian Senate. So I think we have avenues and ways of cooperation that are already being built.
Thanks. Daniel, do you want to add?
Sure. Is that, Camilla, is that Jacques Wagner?
Exactly, exactly, Jacques Wagner.
Beto, I have actually, if I could ask you a follow-up question, Beto. So when we talked a few years ago, you raised this idea that we could really benefit from foreign investment in the Amazon if it's controlled locally. And it seemed to me the argument you made was very similar to a Green New Deal idea, which was in the Amazon, there has been success in reducing deforestation under Lula, but you did not reduce poverty. And now you have a new wave of deforestation connected in part to poverty and inequality. And what you said, you talked about the idea, you said, I don't think you weren't sure if you liked the term, but the idea of a Marshall Plan for the Amazon, again, evoking this terminology. And the idea was, can we find investment in activities in the Amazon that will lift up the standard of living of indigenous peoples and other people living in that region, but will have reforestation instead of deforestation? And I think now that President Biden is talking about trying to put pressure on Brazil around the Amazon, European Union is talking about it, Biden talked a little bit about investment. I think it would just be great to hear from you a few words, like what would a kind of solidaristic green investment in the Amazon look like? And we want to avoid from globally discourses that are going to sound like neocolonialism. What does like a solidaristic version of global green investment in the Amazon look like to you?
Good point. I think there's a lot of room for improvement related to land use. So with, I would say, low-hanging fruits, a lot of low-hanging fruits that we easily, if we have technical assistance and some money, that don't need a lot of money, but it's some money for entrepreneurship and technology and science, can go multiply by 3-5-fold the productivity, for example, of cattle ranching. So it's a lot of room on land use, opportunities for forest restoration that scale up restoration and the size that we need at the global level in terms of carbon sequestration. There's a lot of opportunity as well, and more type forest-based economy relate to new proteins coming from the forest, and as well environmental payment for environmental service. And more people lives in the cities, so we got to find a way to create economy in the cities that actually is not impacts the forest. So it's not. I would say it's not expensive. It's not, but to move forward, we have to kill the cancer. The cancer is deforestation, illegality. If deforestation keeps rising, it's very difficult and then we have to compete with illegal operations. It's hard for the people to invest in the Amazon region right now because it's too risk not only by security risk, but risk in terms of reputation. Its reputation risk is very high. So that's need the political public policy in the front. But I still think it's needed. I think it's possible, but it needs to change course of the political forces in Brasilia to do so.
Thanks so much. And it's interesting, even in the U.S. domestic Green New Deal, one of the parts that's less well developed, conceptualized is the analog to the Civilian Conservation Corps, like thinking about forest preservation. So that would be really, I mean, for our follow-up thinking about this, it'd be very interesting to pursue this. I want to encourage the audience, of which there's still a very large audience, to continue putting questions in the Q&A, because we're going to turn to them in a moment. But I did want to actually just ask one other question to the panel, largely inspired by Thea, but also some of the comments that many of you made about the sort of, nothing's simple. There's dark sides to good ideas. Just as an example, I work in Ecuador, and before the pandemic, the president tried to end the gasoline subsidy, which resulted in pandemonium, and it was the people that you might think would otherwise be the sort of Green New Deal enthusiasts in Ecuador were the ones protesting against it. So it just seems that these are extremely complex issues, as Catherine had talked about. So I wondered if you have other thoughts about, it's easy to say that we should approach this as a just transition and have prior and informed consent, but are there, a couple of practical things that NGOs, governments, intergovernmental agencies should be thinking about centering to help us actually practically implement steps in this direction, whether we call them the Green New Deal or it's sneakier, like Catherine suggests, in a just way. So maybe, I don't know who wants to start here. Maybe Thea, since we're fellow Ecuador enthusiasts.
Sure. Just to clarify the question, do you want me to speak more to like the social demands around that fueled, pun intended, I guess, that protest, sort of demands against austerity, or are you talking more about the costs of the energy transition? Which, because
I'm thinking more like it's easy to say that we should handle this in a just way, but it often there's a real like in that example. I think that the trade-off between doing the thing that's really good for the environment, ending a fuel subsidy and making gasoline in Ecuador cost less than $1 a gallon.
Right.
But it also, at least it was perceived to hurt indigenous communities. So
right.
How do we think through that?
For sure. And the Indigenous Federation that played a key role in that uprising, which was a successful uprising, right? They got the demand that they got the concession that they wanted from the government, embodies that contradiction, because it's one of the key kind of articulators of an anti-extractive politics, at the same time that it was, as you're saying, demanding the reinstatement of a fuel subsidy that it marginally at least benefits the least well off. I think that what that points to very clearly is something that has come up both in what I said and in what both Camilla and Beto said in terms of regional and global cooperation, which is that there's no such thing, in my view, as like a just transition at the scale of Ecuador, right? Like Ecuador on its own, with its existing sectors, with its domestic assets, however you want to kind of conceptualize Ecuador as a nation state, cannot just embark in isolation on an energy transition. Doing so would, I think, just like heighten the contradictions, let's say, between competing social, environmental, and political demands, right? Because right now, the way that social demands are met are through the petrostate, are through funding that is linked to extractive sectors, right? And so if you just have an anti-extractive transition without any, other forms of cooperation, support, and redistribution at other scales of governance, it's really not clear how to address those social demands. And so that, I think it's sort of the scale at which the problems and solutions are often posed as what kind of pits these competing interests against one another. And if we scale up just a little bit, like to the region even, before getting to the world, I think there's all sorts of untapped opportunities for regional planning, cooperation, and redistribution, given the regional inequalities, right? That could help finance, literally like finance the post-extractive transition in Ecuador. And I think that also similar means are needed at a global scale. And I actually almost want to take this opportunity to punt to Camilla, because I'm very curious what she sees as like how a big push, whether at the national or regional, scales, would be financed. Because I see that kind of, again, political economy question that we've been grappling with throughout this as the source in large part of those seemingly diametrically opposed kind of social and environmental demands. And the way to loosen those are through forms of debt reduction and redistributive financing, in my view, at coming from other scales. But I'm curious what Camilla thinks.
Thank you, Theo. That's an excellent question, and it's actually a critical matter we should be looking at. The region, of course, is very heterogeneous, but the issue of a constrained fiscal space is common across Latin American countries. We have been exploring, and this is an undergoing effort, but we have been trying to identify and map possible sources of financing for a big push for sustainability, that is for sustainable investments in diverse areas, in renewable energy, in the bioeconomy, in water management, in education, in health. And I'll tell you a bit about some of what we have already found. We understand that the fiscal responses for the pandemic, they should be continued to a degree. Fiscal stimulus are very important in this context. In order to create the fiscal space to be able to increase or maintain the increase in expenditure in response to the pandemic, there is an opportunity in progressively eliminating fossil fuel subsidies. The region subsidizes significantly fossil fuels. And of course, this has to be progressive, because we understand that currently most of the most vulnerable people depend on fossil fuel for transportation. For instance, the public transportation in the region is very much dependent on buses that rely on diesel and other fossil fuels. So this would have to happen progressively and in parallel to investments in alternative mobility in the region, in electric mobility, in electric buses, trains, etc., in bicycles and active mobility, etc. So the progressive reduction of fossil fuel subsidies would have to happen in a coordinated way with low carbon mobility emissions, so that it does not create any injustices. We have also mapped opportunities with the green bonds. The region has a growing trend in receiving finance from abroad to finance sustainable infrastructure projects. There are climate finance commitments in the region. We have been trying to map the flows of international support for the region in official development assistance and others. We have also mapped opportunities, especially for the Caribbean countries, in combating fiscal illusion and evasion. Of course, we have also been considering carbon pricing alternatives such as carbon taxing or carbon markets. So there are diverse funds, and I think that the main point I want to make here is that we would need to build a portfolio of instruments to tackle specific questions and to be able to maintain a fiscal health over the long term.
Thank you, Camilla. So we have not a ton of time, so I'm going to try to ask a couple of questions from the Q&A in a kind of rapid fashion, and I'll direct them a little more precisely. The first question, I'm going to ask it to you, Beto. It's about how powerful the pro-deforestation interests are in Brazil. So even if Lula became president, would he be able to stop them, or are they so entrenched and powerful that really it's beyond the ability of the of the government to stop them?
I think it's relative easy to stop it, at least to reduce dramatically, because deforestation is very associated with illegality and land grabbers, not associated with production. So it's lacking political support at the majority of the country. But Brazil has tools to do so, monitoring and enforcement.
And while we have you, earlier, since you just now broke up a little bit in your presentation, someone asked in the chat if you could, we lost your definition of nature-based solutions that you were giving. If you could just give us 45 seconds on that.
Okay. I think nature-based solutions in the case of the Brazilian Amazon, it's to actually use the degraded land to plant it to a large-scale reforestation, just to be able to sequestrate a great amount of carbon and to do so and create jobs and help the biodiversity as well. So it can be part of the solution for the climate goals for Paris Agreement.
Thanks, Beto. And the next question, I'm going to direct it to Daniel, actually, which is if we're interested in the U.S. putting pressure on, sorry, let me read it. What would be some effective ways to put more pressure from the U.S. to stop the murder of indigenous leaders, specifically in the Colombian and Brazilian Amazon? I figured the sociologists might have some insight onto this.
Thank you. I think that, I almost want to just punt that question back to Beto, because I'm not, the politics of how to successfully pressure countries in Latin America and the Amazon are not my specialty.
Okay, so Beto or anyone else?
No, it's just quickly. I think the market and the government of the U.S. and other government has tremendous power to press Brazilian and Colombian and other countries to really follow the human rights. I think the indigenous populations is an anti-mandrill attack, both by the COVID as well, because as I say, those lands that belong to the indigenous populations is now invaded by, especially by those illegal loggers, gold miners, and land grabbers. So it's possible, and there we did in the past. I think the political pressure has potential to.
Thanks. And the next question for Catherine: considering the time constraints on the energy transition to meet the climate requirements, my fear is that the rush will cause it to not be done justly, especially the extraction. How do you think we'll be able to meet the raw material needs for the energy transition in a just way, especially considering indigenous rights and also the majority of extraction is residing in the global south? I know any of you could answer this, but I'd love to hear. Let's let Catherine start with this one.
Well, I think Thea probably has been even more focused on this, but I do have a couple of thoughts here. One of them is that this is the downside of the fact that so much of an interest in, say, an energy transition is about cost. Because one of the things that produces low costs is not paying attention to, the cost of extractivism and local communities, going for inputs that are as cheap as possible. And so, I mean, in my mind, this is actually one of the conundrums of the energy transition in particular, that a lot of what is being done these days, because it is being done for cost reasons, also means that, what's the cheapest way to do wind and solar power? Well, import lots of machinery and components and things internationally that can be made cheaply and put it up. And, so I think there's a lot to be concerned about here. And it's a kind of, it's a balancing point that has to be found, because if there's too much in the way of, at some point it becomes too expensive. And so finding that balance between really taking account of the full cost of a commodity chain and still having the product be cheap enough. But part of the issue too is that we have to focus not only on the costs of the commodity chain of, say, renewable energy, but of course the oil industry is hugely costly for local communities. And you don't have to think any further than, say, the Amazon region in Ecuador and Bolivia. There are enormous costs to oil and gas production. And I worry a little bit that when we focus only on the new costs that come with new green industries, that we might be missing the costs that are there in the old industries that maybe in some cases we've kind of priced in. We know that the oil and gas industries are terrible in the Amazon, but here's this new cost for a new community. And I think, maybe this puts us back in that you were saying earlier, this kind of complicated mess of trade-offs. But I think this is one place where we have to think about that, in some ways the question if I had a brilliant idea, I probably wouldn't be a professor. I would be doing something else with my ideas. But I recognize this as really clear conundrums. But I do think it's always important to ask, what do you think are the alternatives to this course of action? Because an alternative that says, well, wind power has these problems in its supply chain, wind power is costly for local communities, without saying, well, if we don't have our power from wind, we're going to be having our power from other sources of electricity. They're also very costly. I mean, there are a lot of ways that we need to think about what a just transition is.
Well, and of course, just as we're getting near the end, a gazillion great questions are popping up in the Q&A. But Thea, on this point, radical agreement? Profound disagreement?
Agreement, but I would add a couple of things, which I think are consonant with Kathy's approach, which is to not ever take for granted or to assume that where resource extraction occurs and the conditions under which it occurs and the volumes and rates under which it occurs are like somehow naturally determined. It just happens to be, weirdly, that the most ethnically and class and geographically marginalized communities are always the places where the most precious resources are. There's actually no relationship, or there's no automatic relationship there. What there is sort of political relationship, which is that these are the places, peoples, and ecosystems that are considered sacrificable or disposable in the name of, let's say, a low cost energy transition. But what we see with anything from lithium to the very wrongly named rare earths is that these are actually quite abundant in the Earth's crust. Not to, we could get into which deposits are high quality, X, Y, and Z, but they're not rare, and they're not only located on the lands of indigenous peoples, right? And so I think there are real questions that critical geographers and also activists have brought to attention of why are they extracted from these places? Are there more equitable ways to actually site the extraction? To go back to Kathy's point about the siting of generation, of renewable energy generation, we can also talk about different choices and trade-offs and sort of justice implications of where extraction is cited. And then the other sort of maybe obvious thing to say that I didn't mention but was on a slide is that while we might not have enough lithium in circulation right now to recycle it and just use recycling as a source of recovered materials, we do face this critical juncture where if we build recycling and recovery capacity now and also force some redesign into batteries and cars, we could in the near term start supplying from recovered materials, right? And so I think it's always how do we avoid new mining and how do we avoid deep inequities in the siting of that mining?
Well, I myself have pages of notes and also now pages of Q&A, but unfortunately we've come to the end of our time. So I'm going to hand things back to Daniel, but let me just add my thank you to the panel. It was really wonderful and I learned a lot. Look forward to corresponding with all of you to learn more from you in the coming weeks. Daniel, take it away.
Thank you, Michael, so much for this brilliant moderation. Huge thanks to Thea, Catherine, Camilla, and Beto. This is an amazingly focused panel, I thought, with a really brilliant dialogue and intersection of themes. So the political economy of the green transition in Latin America, we've had a big advance in talking about it today. I also want to thank, in particular, those who made this panel possible, in particular, Emma Glasser, who is the kind of lead researcher for this panel series, and also Shannon Crane from Penn's Population Study Center, who's done fantastic work supporting the logistics of this panel. And I want to remind all of you, you will be getting emails, probably more than you want. The video will be, of this event will be public. You'll get an email with the link, and you'll also be emailed once we have the kind of full online portfolio on the Global Green New Deal available, where you'll get to dive into individual Q&As with every single one of these panelists and with the moderator, Michael, to get sort of further and deeper thoughts from our panelists on all these questions, in addition to multiple links where you can follow up on their work. This was the second of our 3-panel series on the Global Green New Deal. Our third and final event takes up the question of US engagement with Chinese climate politics. And we're going to be talking about progressive alternatives to Cold War posturing. So please register. You'll get emails with the links. I posted a link in the chat, or you can go to bit.ly/US and Chinese climate politics pen. It's missing the bit.ly on that image there. But again, so next Wednesday, the third and final panel in our series. But for today's panel, again, huge thanks to everybody who came out to stream on YouTube and to all the panelists. Thank you again very much, and look forward to keeping the conversation going in the future. Take care. Thanks, everybody.